Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. This is the most famous line from a speech given by Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. on August 28, 1963, in Washington, D.C. This was at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, which lasted more than a decade. The purpose of this movement was for equal rights for African Americans and other minorities. 100 years after the end of the Civil War, African Americans were still fighting to have access to equal rights. The end of the war, even though slavery was over, it was still a fight for African Americans to have simple rights like education. In most parts of the country, they did not have access or ability to do the same thing that white Americans could do, like own a land. The 13th Amendment was passed and abolished slavery completely, but they had to fight hard to become considered citizens of the United States. When the 14th Amendment passed in 1868, African Americans were citizens, but they were still limited in their rights and oppression was strong. For many years, African Americans worked hard to gain status in society, but still faced many years of feeling less than equal to others. The modern civil rights movement is marked at the beginning of 1954, when the Supreme Court ruled that it was illegal to segregate schools. This means that schools could not longer tell African Americans that they could not go to school where white Americans went. Other events took place during this time in history that would be very important for African Americans. Another event was when Rosa Parks was arrested in 1955 for refusing to give her seat up on the bus to a white man. She was arrested and found guilty. Years later, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. organized a peaceful march to Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1963 with over 200,000 people. He would deliver his famous I Have a Dream speech. The next year, the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, which meant desegregation was ended. It was now illegal to separate African Americans and whites from going to the same places. Since the 60s, African Americans have more rights than ever before, but there is still a struggle and they do not always feel equal in society even today. In the summer of 2020, a man named George Floyd was killed in the daylight by a white police officer. This led to hundreds of protests all over the United States and even the world. Some would say this was a new civil rights movement called Black Lives Matter, like the one in the 50s and 60s. Many argue that there's still severe oppression in society on African Americans, which includes voting oppression and higher levels of incarceration. In conclusion, compared to the end of civil wars in 1865, many things have changed. Reverend King's speech in 1963 was revolutionary. It marked the beginning of a new era for African Americans who were considered citizens but not given all the same rights as others in the United States. The modern civil rights movement made great changes to how African Americans were treated and the civil liberty they were given. I am happy that these moments in history occur so that the United States could become the great nation that it is, full of diversity and people of all backgrounds. This is a blessed country where many people come from all over the world to make good life for themselves. And without the civil rights movement, it could not have been a very different story for so many people, including myself. My name is Marcus. Thank you so very much for listening to me.